Is it possible that the carbon-14 test itself was in some way flawed? I've come to Oxford, site of one of the 3 labs which conducted the landmark tests 20 years ago. Is it possible that the margin of error of plus or minus 65 years was wrong? Should it have been wider? Is it, after all, not the shroud that may be found wanting, but the carbon-14 test applied to it? On the 20th anniversary of that test, physicists are preparing a new carbon-14 test. It will show if the original carbon-14 test could have lied. Professor Christopher Ramsey now runs the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit and was present here when the original test was run on the shroud.
I mean, anything is always somewhat provisional. There are always new experiments you can do. Most scientific experiments are only verified by being repeated many times, and then you reckon if you can repeat the experiment and maybe do it in a different way, you get the same answer, you're convinced. With the shroud, you're in a slightly difficult position because obviously you can't go on dating it lots and lots of times. As a scientist, I'm much more interested in getting the right answer than I am in sticking to an answer which we came to before. My own hunch at the moment from the weight of scientific data and other data would be that the shroud is medieval, but I don't necessarily think I will always hold that, and I'm certainly open to inquiries that would indicate otherwise.
Could the shroud have been contaminated in any way?
The significance of this particular hypothesis for contamination was that it's the first that's had the capability, at least in principle, of shifting the date by a very large amount without very much contamination. And so that's why we were doing these experiments to try to see if carbon monoxide from the atmosphere would react with linen in the way that you would have to have for this hypothesis to work.
The team in Colorado is asking whether the results of the 1988 carbon-14 test could have been distorted. Up there in the stratosphere is where the carbon-14 isotope is created as the cosmic rays hit the atmosphere. And since the shroud was tested 20 years ago, more is known about its transition from there to the plants from which the linen is made. Based on this new knowledge, Jackson is the man who has studied the shroud closer and longer than anyone else. John Jackson is a doctor in cosmology and lecturer in physics. In 1978, when interest in the shroud was at its height, he led a large team of scientists to Turin, where they examined the shroud for a week. No one since has secured such full access to the cloth. Significant amounts of different types of data were extracted. Jackson became the primary custodian of this data, and he has continued the work. Only now does he feel ready to share his findings exclusively with us. And his team have developed a new hypothesis that could explain why the age of the shroud sample tested 20 years ago is younger than the rest of the evidence would suggest. Scientists have now discovered that before it's absorbed into carbon dioxide, the carbon-14 isotope actually spends up to 2 months in the atmosphere as carbon monoxide. If the carbon monoxide bonded with the linen of the shroud, it could have made the cloth appear younger. In fact, a 2% contamination is all it would take to distort the age of the cloth by 1,300 years. Let me understand you in layman's terms, right? If you can establish here that there has been this contamination of the material, it would mean that the shroud material would have been therefore dated much earlier than it actually is.
Well, it would mean that the radiocarbon dating of the shroud would have dated a contaminated sample that would mean that the radiocarbon date was incorrect.
The team is now getting ready to begin the long process of testing the new hypothesis. Using samples of modern linen, the team plan to carry out a series of tests to find out whether its true age can be distorted. The experiments will take some time. They need to submit the samples to all the possible conditions that the Shroud of Turin itself could have been subjected to. Its storage, extreme heat, ultraviolet light, handling, water, and so on. The tests could help resolve the anomaly at the heart of the study of the Shroud.
The bottom is zero.
The time has come to ask Professor Christopher Ramsey at the Oxford Radiocarbon Unit.
If the hypotheses which John Jackson have come up with do have any validity scientifically, if they do stand up to experiment, they will have much wider implications as well for other samples which might have gone through the same process. So it's, it's part of the scientific inquiry to continue to investigate possible ways of improving techniques and so on.
The Oxford laboratory has agreed to test the samples being prepared by Jackson's team, and the first batch of samples of linen in normal storage conditions is ready for Professor Ramsey to test. How have these preliminary samples tested? And does Professor Ramsey feel there is any future for this investigation?
The significance of this particular hypothesis for contamination was that it's the first that's had the capability, at least in principle, of shifting the date by a very large amount without very much contamination. And so that's why we were doing these experiments to try to see if carbon monoxide from the atmosphere would react with linen in the way that you would have to have for this hypothesis to work. The samples that we've had so far, which have been in fairly sort of normal conditions, heated linen and stored with carbon monoxide, we haven't yet seen any evidence of reaction between the carbon monoxide and the linen. So far, there's nothing in this hypothesis that would appear to undermine the original radiocarbon dating measurements.
All we can know for certain is that before Turin, the Shroud can only be reliably traced back to the village of Lire in France, where it was in the possession of this man, Geoffroy de Charnay, who first exhibited it in 1360. That date is very significant because carbon-14 dates the Shroud at 1325, plus or minus 65 years. It all seems to check out.
We haven't yet seen any evidence of reaction between the carbon monoxide and the linen. So far, there's nothing in this hypothesis that would appear to undermine the original radiocarbon dating measurements.
Getting it to look right is one thing. Getting it to be right, chemistry, physics-wise, is a whole separate issue.
Carbon-14 dates the Shroud at 1325, plus or minus 65 years. It all seems to check out.
And to date, 29 years, no one has even come close. No one.
There's nothing in this hypothesis that would appear to undermine the original radiocarbon dating measurements.